Hi everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how your brain decides what is important to pay attention to and what to ignore? It feels automatic, right? But what if you could actually control that process to make your brain focus better? Today, we're diving into a fascinating study that explores exactly that, looking at how our voluntary attention, the kind you consciously decide to use, affects how our brain processes unexpected things, especially when we're listening. So, we know attention is like a filter for our brain, helping us focus on what is important. But how does this filter actually work when it comes to noticing when something unexpected happens, especially something we weren't expecting to hear? This study aimed to figure that out by looking at brain responses to sound omissions. Now, predictive coding is a big idea in neuroscience. Think of your brain as a super-powered prediction machine. It is constantly trying to guess what is going to happen next based on everything it has learned. When what actually happens matches what it predicted, everything's smooth. But when there is a mismatch, that is a prediction error. And your brain needs to update its predictions. Attention, the researchers suggest, might be like a dial that controls how much attention our brain pays to these prediction errors. But, and this is a big but, previous research has been a bit all over the place, especially when looking at brain signals tied to actual sound. To get around those tricky issues, these scientists decided to take a different approach. Instead of looking at brain responses to sounds that do happen, they looked at what happens when a sound is expected but suddenly doesn't happen. This is called a stimulus omission. If your brain predicts a sound and it is not there, that is a clear prediction error signal, and it is not mixed up with the brain's response to a sound that is actually there. They set up a cool experiment. Imagine watching hands clap. Most of the time you hear the clap sound at the same time, but once in a while the sound is just missing. They used EEG, which measures brain electrical activity, to see how people's brains reacted to these silent claps. They found that these omissions caused a whole cascade of brain responses happening in stages. There were early responses that seemed like basic sensory processing, and later responses that looked like more complex prediction error activity. The big question was how voluntary attention would mess with these omission responses. They played with attention in two main ways. First, they told people to focus their attention either on what they were seeing, the clapping hands, or what they were hearing, the clap sound. Second, they told people to either pay attention only at the exact moment of the clap, like a quick burst of attention, or to keep their attention turned on throughout the whole trial sustained attention. This created four main scenarios: visual transient, visual sustained, auditory transient, and auditory sustained. So what did they find? The really early brain responses to the missing sound, called the omission N1, were completely untouched by any of the attention tricks. It didn't matter if people were looking at the visual part or listening for the auditory part, or if their attention was a quick flash or continuous. The initial prediction error signal at this early stage was the same for everyone. But here is where it gets really interesting. The later brain responses, especially the omission P3, which is thought to be a more complex type of prediction error signal, were hugely affected by attention. When people were told to pay attention to the auditory part, the part where the sound was supposed to be, they got strong omission P3 responses. Their brains really reacted to the missing sound. But when people were told to pay attention to the visual part, the clapping hands, those later omission responses became much weaker or didn't show up at all. This is a really big takeaway. It suggests that our attention system isn't like a single simple filter. It can selectively boost or dampen different stages of processing. It doesn't mess with the very first basic sensory prediction error signal, but it can influence the later, more complex stages where our brain figures out what that prediction error really means and decides what to do about it. It is like your attention is a sophisticated tool that can fine-tune how your brain deals with surprises. This research also hints at how this might happen, suggesting that neurotransmitter systems like norepinephrine might be involved in this attention-driven modulation, particularly at those later stages. And importantly, this method of studying omissions with controlled attention is a really promising way to understand how our brain weights information based on its precision, how reliable it thinks it is. Before we dive deeper into the implications, let's quickly touch on the methods. 36 participants were involved. They watched videos of hands clapping, and sometimes the sound of the clap was missing. They had to respond to occasional targets with a button press. The researchers made sure that people were actually paying attention to the right things by having them look for visual targets in visual attention conditions and listen for auditory targets in auditory attention conditions. And importantly, their ability to detect these targets was really high across the board, meaning they were generally engaged and performing the tasks well. This is good because it means the differences they saw in brain activity were likely due to the attention manipulation itself. not because people were struggling with the task. And to double check, they asked participants how much attention they paid to what they saw versus heard. Unsurprisingly, when people were told to focus on vision, they reported paying a lot of attention to vision, and when they were told to focus on hearing, they reported paying a lot of attention to hearing. This confirms that their attention manipulation was working. Good. Interestingly, when people were attending to the auditory modality, their reaction times to auditory targets were faster than those attending to the visual modality. This makes sense. If you are actively listening for something, you are likely to react to it quicker. The sustained attention conditions were also generally faster than the transient ones. Now remember how they used EEG and analyzed it using something called principal component analysis, or PCA. Think of PCA as a way to break down a complex signal, like the EEG data, into its basic building blocks or components. This helped them isolate and study those different brain responses, like the Omission N1 and Omission P3, more clearly. They found many components, but focused on the ones that looked like the expected omission responses. As we mentioned, the early omission N1, which happens around 104 milliseconds after the expected sound was missed, showed no difference between attending to visual or auditory information. Even the slightly later omission N1, around 136 milliseconds, also didn't show any differences based on attention. The omission N2, occurring around 168 milliseconds, showed some interesting patterns, particularly over temporal areas, but the differences weren't as clear-cut or robust as what they found later on. But then came the omission P3 components. The first one, OP321, starting around 338 milliseconds, showed stronger responses when attention was directed to the auditory modality. When people were focused on the visual aspect, this P3 response was noticeably weaker. The OP322, appearing around 370 milliseconds, also showed this pattern, although the effect was a bit more mixed across conditions. And the latest component they analyzed, OP323, peaking at 432 milliseconds, really highlighted the impact of auditory attention. Again, robust responses when people were listening and significantly reduced or absent responses when they were focused on vision. Looking at the figures showing these later P3 responses makes it really clear. When attention was directed to the sound, you see these big positive bumps in the brain activity. When attention was directed away, those bumps flatten out considerably. So, what does this all mean? The researchers are suggesting that the brain's initial prediction error signal, the very first detection of whoa, that sound isn't there, is pretty automatic. It is not easily swayed by what you are voluntarily trying to focus on. This is actually a bit surprising to some theories, which predicted that attention would boost even these early signals. They argue that the early auditory omission response, the ON1, is mainly tied to the sensory processing itself. It is not really boosted or diminished by where you decide to put your attention. This holds true even when the prediction of the sound is well established. The ON2 component showed some hints that it might be affected by whether attention was fleeting or sustained, but the findings weren't strong enough to draw firm conclusions. It's possible that different types of focus influence these intermediate processing stages in distinct ways. The real star of the show is the OP3. This is where attention makes a big difference. The fact that these later responses, possibly related to updating our understanding of the world and integrating information, are so strongly influenced by attention is key. This study highlights a really sophisticated aspect of attention. It's not just turning up the volume on everything. It seems to be able to selectively boost or suppress specific parts of the brain's response based on what is relevant to the task at hand. The OP3 is thought to be linked to things like our locus coeruleus system, which releases norepinephrine, a chemical that plays a big role in alertness and how our brain processes important signals. So, when attention is directed to the sound, the system might get a boost, leading to those larger P3 responses. The fact that the OP3 was so diminished or absent when attention was directed away from the auditory modality is also telling. It suggests that our brain might not even bother to fully process a prediction error if it is not relevant to our current goals. It is like the brain says, okay, a sound is missing, but I am looking at this cool visual thing, so I am not going to waste a lot of processing power on that unexpected silence. So, to sum it up, this study provides strong evidence that voluntary attention doesn't affect the earliest stages of processing an unexpected sound omission. Your brain notices the missing sound quite automatically. However, attention does significantly influence the later stages, particularly the OP3 response. If you are paying attention to the modality where the omission occurs, you get a much stronger brain response. If you are paying attention elsewhere, that response is greatly reduced. This really helps us understand how our brain's prediction mechanisms work with attention. It's not a blunt instrument. It's a finely tuned system that can prioritize processing based on our goals. This could have implications for how we learn, how we maintain focus, and how we react to surprising events in our environment. For example, if you are trying to learn a new skill that involves sound, like playing an instrument, this research suggests that to really absorb the information and update your internal models, you need to be actively paying attention to the auditory feedback. One limitation to consider is that even with careful controls, there might be subtle differences. And while they control for temporal predictions, the type of sound and video might have inherent features that, despite efforts, still influence attention differently. Future research could explore other types of sounds or visual stimuli, or even delve into different brain states to see if these effects hold. But overall, this study gives us a fantastic glimpse into the intricate dance between prediction, attention, and how our brain makes sense of the world, especially when things don't go exactly as planned. It shows that our conscious focus really matters, not just for what we perceive, but for how our brain actually processes and learns from those unexpected moments. What do you guys think about this? Does this align with your own experiences of focusing or losing focus? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this dive into the brain's prediction system as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the amazing world of psychology and neuroscience. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.